New Zealand doesn't have mandatory consent education. To my mind, that is just baffling. This is such an important part of our lives. We consent or don't consent to things on an everyday basis. To not equip young people with the tools to be able to do that in a healthy way is hugely problematic.
Welcome to the Research and Reason podcast. Join us as we discuss the latest research, news and opinion from academics in the Faculty of Arts and Education at the University of Auckland.
Kia ora koutou, ko Julianne Evans, toku ingoa. I'm Julianne Evans, the Media Advisor for the Faculty of Arts and Education. And today I'm talking to Senior Lecturer in Criminology, Dr. Claire Meehan, who specialises in the relationships between young people's sexual lives and digital technology, and in particular online pornography. Tēnā koe, Claire, lovely to have you here.
Thank you so much for inviting me along today, Julianne.
Now, you published a book in 2023, The Politics of Porn for Young People in New Zealand, published by Springer International, and you've got another one in the pipeline for 2026, so you've been very busy. Let's start perhaps with the first book, because our listeners probably don't know about it. You had to talk to a lot of young people in Aotearoa, New Zealand, about their porn watching habits. Now, I would imagine that wasn't something that was an easy do, but for all sorts of reasons. What were some of the challenges of that?
So I did. And before we start, let me just say that the young people that I did speak to were amazing. They were so much fun and they were so engaged in this research. So whenever I set out to do the research, my first challenge was bringing it to the ethics committee. And I think the members of the ethics committee thought, like most adults, oh my goodness, I don't want you talking to my kids. I don't want this sort of thing being out there and maybe seen as being encouraged in schools. So really it was thinking about ways how we could get this research out there without putting teachers or schools under pressure, but at the same time not diluting or sanitising the research. So one of the things I needed to do was speak to quite young people, so young people from 12 to 16. Originally, the ethics committee and some of my colleagues and advisors suggested I speak with older young people, but for me it was important at that age because it's a chance to really gain insights into how porn is affecting them, not just in terms of their viewing behaviours, but the broader issues around consent, for example, or discrimination or pleasure or those who are questioning their sexuality. So there were lots of issues that come out of it. So once I got it through the ethics committee, which thankfully I did after a number of iterations, the next challenge then was approaching schools and telling them, this is the research that I want to do. These are the reasons why I want to do it. Do you think your young people would be open to it? So because there were young people under 16, I also needed not only their consent, but parental consent. Once it was advertised in schools, I was actually oversubscribed with young people wanting to do this research, which was amazing. Mm. Yes. And I often joked that one of the things that came up quite a bit was a bit of concern from other adults that, well, this is potentially a sensitive or embarrassing thing to talk about. So young people may not want to sit and talk to another adult about this topic.
Especially someone they don't know, but then maybe it was easier for to be someone they don't know.
Right. And so I went in thinking, okay, well, we'll see how the groups go. So I chose groups of young people that knew each other. So they were established friends, and I thought that might be a little bit more comfortable for them. And after I'd completed the research, I used to joke that I barely made it out of these sessions alive because they had so many questions. They had so many perspectives. They were just amazing. And I would often joke, so each time we did one of the interviews, the small friendship group interviews, I would bring a big box of Lego. And the idea with the Lego is that if they didn't want to look at me or they wanted something to sort of, draw attention away from what they were talking about or to make them feel a little bit more comfortable, they could have this Lego. Of course, the boys built lots of Lego penises. So I got quite a few of those over the years. But they were absolutely amazing. And what was incredible is just their depth of knowledge and the ideas that they were able to articulate. They didn't use the same academic jargon as we do. So, for example, thinking about misogyny or double standards. But they did have all of these ideas. They were able to relate these big, complex concepts to their own lives. And they were very open and honest around the sort of porn that impacted them, not necessarily porn even that they were watching, although again there was honesty about the type of porn they were watching, but even porn that others were watching, porn that they had been sent via links in WhatsApp groups, porn that they just spoke about with their friends. And I think again, as adults, we come in with this notion that we don't want our kids watching porn. I have 2 very young children myself, so they're not at the porn watching stage. But even thinking myself about my kids watching porn makes me feel uncomfortable. It makes me feel sort of a bit icky. But we also have to be realistic that it's very much out there and we can't just work against it. We have to work with it, and we have to try and equip our young people to be in a society where porn exists and to understand it, rather than telling them just avoid it, just, don't watch it. So yes, it was challenging research to get across the line. It was challenging in terms of some of the things that young people told me that maybe they had stumbled upon while watching porn. They didn't know where to go with these concerns.
Distressing content, you mean?
Distressing content, or what I saw quite a bit was young men in particular who were very worried about the frequency at which they were watching porn and that they were addicted to porn. Now, whenever I compared these with other young people, the frequency wasn't actually that much, but it was this sense that it was too much, so they must be addicted. So unpacking this further, some of the messages that we are putting forward is, porn's very dangerous, it's very addictive, if you watch too much you'll become addicted. And a real anxiety for these young men was that they were addicted to porn. So it wasn't so much what they were watching, it was how they were trying to deal with this idea that they might be addicted. And some of them were adopting quite unhealthy ways of dealing with this, a form of trauma, I guess. And
shame, I suppose.
Very much shame, absolutely.
Shameful and not able to be talked about.
No.
And how old were some of these
So these
people?
were boys maybe 15, 16 years old. And because, again, the messaging that they received was that porn is shameful, you will become addicted, you shouldn't watch it. So if they were watching it and they had concerns about being addicted, they felt that was a big barrier to actually talking about it. So instead they were doing things like deciding, I'm not going to masturbate for 3 months. Now, again, talking about masturbation with young boys it's a little bit awkward, I'm not going to lie, but it is a healthy thing that young people do. And, it's recognised that there are benefits to young people masturbating. And again, it does feel awkward even saying that out loud. But in their mind, that porn and masturbation were so wrapped up together that they couldn't be separated. And rather than being able to talk about some of these concerns, it was a sort of all or nothing approach. There were also other challenges around porn, around young women, for example, being pressurised into performing certain things that they didn't necessarily want to do, but that were widely accepted.
You mean online, watching people doing that online, or having to do it in real life?
More having to do it in real life.
Oh, I see.
So at the moment in porn, we see a lot of anal sex, for example, and that is considered, the pinnacle of the sexual experience on porn. And a lot of young women didn't want to have anal sex, and they felt a little bit of pressure that this was now seen as almost something that happens, as once you have sex, you have vaginal sex, and then you have anal sex. So there's issues there around consent as well that we really need to grapple with. But if we don't talk about porn and we don't have those conversations, albeit challenging conversations about porn, then it closes off other conversations around, for example, consent. So yes, it's awkward. Yes, it is a bit uncomfortable to have these conversations, but it's absolutely necessary. And I would even argue urgent that we do.
How many people did you speak to in the end?
So I've done a number of studies. I've been looking and researching these areas for a decade or more. And so I've spoken to hundreds of young people all across New Zealand. I've spoken with adults as well, with people with a vested interest in this area. So thinking about teachers, youth workers, sex therapists, clinicians. So I've had a wide range of experiences, and people have very generously given up their time to talk about this. But my main focus is on doing research with young people, so not on them, with them, so producing it with them. So yeah, hundreds across New Zealand over the years.
And what about, how does that sort of feed into what's happening at schools with relationship and sexuality education? How, is online pornography and those kinds of things a part of those programs, do you know? Or should it be? Or
It absolutely should be. So really it depends on the school. And I find it's a very worrying time in the world at the moment. It's a very worrying time to be a young person, particularly a young woman. As we can see, we're seeing a rise in misogyny and hate and discrimination, sexism, anti-feminist backlash. We're seeing all of these things happen, and it's not necessarily being responded to, I think, in the way that it could be or should be. So we know that sexuality education under the current government in New Zealand is being rolled back. One of the things that sexuality education needs to be is inclusive. It needs to be inclusive and it needs to be holistic. There have been concerns, and I would even go as far as to say a moral panic, over young people having access to inclusive sexuality education. And again, we're seeing in New Zealand and elsewhere a massive backlash against the rainbow community, for example. You know, we've seen it in New Zealand. We've seen it in a very palpable, tangible way. We're seeing it with what's happening in America at the moment. We're seeing it all over the world. And for our young people, we, instead of giving them a safe space to acknowledge who they are, to realise who they are, we're taking that away. And that is, in my mind, very counterproductive. So yes, porn should be absolutely in the curriculum. It has to be. As I said before, we can't avoid it. It would be unrealistic to try and avoid it. But rather than it being included, it's just being rolled back and rolled back. Again, we spoke about consent a minute ago. New Zealand doesn't have mandatory consent education. To my mind, that is just baffling. This is such an important part of our lives. We consent or don't consent to things on an everyday basis. Do not equip young people with the tools to be able to do that in a healthy way is hugely problematic. So yes, it should be part of the curriculum. It should be wider than that, but it is being rolled back. I'm sure you've heard recently about certain phrases that are coming out of the sort of right-wing online misogynistic space. So for example, if we think about My Body, My Choice, that was originally around reproductive rights. It is now being co-opted to Your Body, My Choice. So we're seeing all of these things, all of these obstacles that young women are having to deal with that they weren't before. A recent survey that came out of the UK just over a year and a half ago said that attitudes towards women are worse now than they were 50 years ago. Gosh. So we're absolutely going backwards. So really, we need better relationships and sexuality education. We have amazing teachers in New Zealand, but we need to put resourcing into these areas. It's absolutely critical for our young people.
What about parents? What do you think? Where do they sit in this whole equation? Because speaking from the point of view of a mother of a 19-year-old son,
yeah.
I'd like to say that I've been very open and honest and had these sorts of discussions. And the fact is I probably haven't, because every time I've tried to, I've got the response of, Mum, I don't want to hear about it. I don't need to know about it. I know already, sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, you're utterly shut down. So,
yeah, 100%.
So where do you go?
And I think this is it. I think a big thing is removing the shame, which you're doing. I think also we're so caught up in shame as a society, and shame around sex and sexuality, and particularly young people and sex and sexuality. Everything is bound in shame. And if young people, or anyone really, experiences sexual assault, even though they're a victim, there's still so much shame involved with it. So I think that even if your young people don't want to hear about the birds and the bees and everything else that that entails, just removing shame, knowing that you're a safe space. If they do have questions, concerns, if they want to talk about this, there's so much shame. I think also for schools and youth organisations, policymakers, recognising that a lot of young people don't want to talk to their parents about this. And that is, it's perfectly understandable. It is an embarrassing thing to talk about. It's awkward, It may not be a conversation you want to have with your parents. If it is, fantastic, but it may not be. So again, thinking, who are the best people to work with young people? My personal recommendation is young people. Young people are the experts in their lives. I don't understand why they're not involved at every stage of relationships and sexuality education, for example. Thinking about the research, they know best what's going on with them. Policy, how is this best delivered to young people? What content needs to be included? How might they want the information? What would make sexuality education meaningful?
We need to ask them, in other words.
We do need to ask them. We absolutely.
And that's what you've been doing.
Yeah, and that's what I've been doing. And there's so many other researchers that are doing this as well. But it seems to be there's an obstacle. So once they tell us what they want, tell us what they need, then it's very hard to translate that into real life implication.
I'm interested in connecting what you were saying before about pornography and watching porn with the position of women and how women have in the past been positioned, literally, metaphorically, in pornography, because it feels like a bit of a man's world out there,
100%.
But I'm sure it's not entirely. There must be all sorts of other, variations on that. But I think that might be an objection that people who grew up in the 80s like me as a sort of a feminist might have about the whole concept, really, is my fear. Yeah. That it essentially denigrates women. And I'm just interested in your point of view on that.
Absolutely. And putting my cards on the table, I am a staunch feminist researcher. Also, having grown up in the 80s, I completely understand the implication for women. And I think that by recognising that porn isn't going anywhere, we're not saying that it treats women well, and it doesn't. And I think one of the things that we need to do is that we need to be educating young people how to interpret it. But the changes need to go beyond that. Our young people of today, in a couple of decades, some of them are going to be involved in porn, either as performers or in the industry as producers, for example. And we need to be thinking about equality. We need to be thinking about treatment of women. So it's not just about porn being this abstract thing that we think about in terms of viewing, but it's also how we create changes within the porn industry. So we know, for example, that with the advent of the internet, online porn is much more accessible than it was to, for example, go and get a Playboy magazine a couple of decades ago. And what we've got with that is more and more porn being produced, and it's almost become disposable. So if someone goes onto Pornhub, for example, they're likely to watch multiple clips, but between the time they're on there. So they don't watch one thing. It's click, 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 and then that's that. So it's recognizing that porn isn't real life. So you don't see condoms in porn, for example. You don't see consent in porn. Those things happen off screen. It's recognizing that if something happens in porn, it shouldn't necessarily happen in real life. But it's also widening our interpretation of porn. So we often think about porn as the free mainstream porn we get in Pornhub, for example. Whereas porn is actually a bit of an umbrella term. So there's lots of different genres within that. So you have feminist porn, you have alt porn, you have queer porn, you have lots of different more inclusive porn. One of the challenges for young people is that for more inclusive porn, you usually have to pay for it. And this makes sense because performers should be paid. However, then that young people aren't necessarily watching that type of porn, but it is absolutely out there. And I think, recognizing that porn serves a purpose, but it's not inherently good either. It's being realistic that it's there, but it's recognizing the challenges with it, the downfalls with it, particularly for women and for young women. And again, if you watch porn and look at the genital touch, for example, it's all about the man. So it's about his pleasure. So he is the active participant, and women are often positioned as a passive means to achieving that pleasure. And I think that's also another area that sexuality education needs to include, and that is women's pleasure, because that is often absent from porn. And again, because sex and pleasure, women's pleasure, is so shrouded in shame, we just don't talk about this. So porn is seen as something for men. So again, we reproduce this cycle of women being treated badly in porn. If young women watch porn, which a lot of them do, they have shame to talk about it. They're ashamed to talk about it. So it's really wrapped up in shame.
It's a really self-fulfilling prophecy, though.
100% it is. And it's really, really problematic.
What about the next book? Because we're suddenly realising we could keep on talking about this for ages. There's so many aspects to it. But how does your next book connect to the first one or to the last one?
So I think, again, thinking specifically about young women and consent. So the next book is on consent. And there are a number of things that have happened in the last few years. So we've had sexual consent being seen as between two people who are going to perform some sort of sexual activity. Then we've seen this move into the digital realm. So thinking about intimate images and intimate image sharing. And we know, again, this is highly gendered. So if a young woman takes an intimate image of herself and she sends that to someone consensually for no one else's eyes, and it is shared non-consensually, we know that the harms for her are much, much worse than for a young man. So thinking about digital consent, what that looks like, we often use the term, which I hate, which is revenge pornography. And that is really inaccurate, because revenge suggests that it's, someone scoring the ex-boyfriend, for example, which isn't always the case. But also it likens this abusive material to pornography, which is consensual. And those two things are not the same. We've also had another kind of evolution of the internet in terms of AI and deepfakes. So at the moment, I'm conducting research around deepfakes and how the impact of that on a form of non-consensual pornography. So where bodies are taken, photos are taken, and a person is depicted as performing a sexual act on another person. But they didn't. Mm-hmm. And then it's shared. Now, a lot of people have said to me, well, I don't really see what the problem is, because it wasn't the person. It doesn't matter. It looks like them. Mm-hmm. To all intents and purposes, it is them. So the harm is exactly the same.
It's bullying, isn't it?
Of course
it's horrible
it is.
Kind of bullying.
But it goes even further than that, because it's very gendered, it's very specific, it's misogynistic, it's humiliating, it's taking away a person's sexual autonomy, it's doing all of these things. But even in our legislation, we haven't caught up with this. So in New Zealand, we have the Harmful Digital Communications Act. So that is sort of a catch-all piece of legislation if someone has, for example, intimate images shared without consent. Now, it is somewhat effective, but we have then this newer area of digital harm and digital sexual abuse, which is deepfakes. So legislation is lacking behind, education is lacking behind. So I'm trying to work with young people at the moment to understand what it is that they need. What are the impacts of the proliferation of deepfakes at the moment? And there are so many of them. So the next book is looking specifically at consent. So it's around consent in a person-on-person basis, consent in a digital arena, and consent with AI and deepfakes, and how we, again, really work with our young people to understand what it is they need, what we can do better. Because at the moment, we're not really doing enough.
Who do you hope reads that book when it comes out? Does it have a title?
So the title is subject to change, but the title at the moment is on Tangling the Complexities of Sexual Consent for Young People. So I'm hoping that it's read by, obviously, academics, but also teachers, policymakers, other educators. It's probably going to be a bit of a dry book for young people, let's be honest. However, what I do is I was publish magazines and things that are a bit more exciting for young people to read as well.
Version.
A young adults version. And I try to give back to the young people that have given so much to the research by doing public presentations and things like that. So I'm hoping the messages go far and wide because, again, as I said before, the young people are the experts here, and we need to know from them how this is affecting them, what they need, what we can do better. So that's what I'm hoping for this book.
I think it's very worthwhile. I especially think it's worthwhile in this environment, as you say. We've got International Women's Day. We've got all these things where we look back and think, how far have we come, and how far we still have to go. And it feels like we're in slightly tricky waters at the moment again.
Absolutely, and even thinking about feminism, and we need feminism, but so many of our young women are also turning away from feminism because it's been portrayed as something we no longer need. Whereas we do.
We need it more now than ever.
We need it more now than ever. So yes, this book, like all of my scholarship, is going to be underpinned by staunch feminism. And just to be clear, feminism doesn't exclude young men. Feminism is for the good of everyone. So I'm hoping that in these crazy times we're living in, and unfortunately the rise of hate that we're seeing, we can try and stand up against this and fight.
Yes, we can. So thank you so much, Claire. I wish you all the best with that book, and thank you for coming to talk to us.
Thank you so much for having me.
You've been listening to the Research and Reason podcast. Stay up to date with the Faculty of Arts and Education by following us on social media.